They don't scream when they charge. That's the part no one tells you. Every species I've ever catalogued in 22 years of field intelligence, the Veth, the Karani, the Marasi siege runners, they all vocalize during assault. It's biology. It's the body's way of bleeding off the pressure before the nervous system collapses under its own adrenaline load. You scream, or you freeze. That's the math. Humans don't scream. They go quiet. And then, they move, and the silence moves with them, and by the time the noise comes, if the noise comes, it isn't theirs. I've spent 4 months embedded with a human special operations unit. I have 2,847 timestamped log entries. I have 3 cracked data tablets, a recurring stress fracture in my left secondary claw from gripping things too hard, and what my ship's physician diplomatically describes as a correctable sleep architecture disorder. I'm not correcting it. Because every time I close my eyes, I replay timestamp 0041. The night I finally understood what the other species meant when they said, "Don't let them get quiet." This is what I saw. I requested this assignment. I want that on record. I want it on record specifically because in 6 weeks, when I'm filing a formal petition for psychological leave, someone in the directorate is going to look at this log and say, "Well, Observer Oren, you did ask for this." And I want them to know, yes. Yes, I did. And I was an idiot. And I would do it again. My name is Sevad Oren. I am 39 cycles old. My specialty is behavioral pattern analysis in asymmetric conflict scenarios. My citation list is 12 pages. My mother thinks I work in military tourism, which is an embarrassing lie I have maintained for 11 years because the alternative is explaining what I actually do at family dinners, and that goes poorly. I log everything. Every operation. Every meal. Every ambient temperature shift in the briefing room. My supervisor calls it a compulsion. I call it methodology. We disagree on a lot of things, which is probably why he approved my transfer request, a fact I've logged as well. The human unit I've been assigned to observe calls itself Ghost Actual. 12 operators. 1 commander. The directorate's brief described them as Tier 1 assets with confirmed kills across 7 active theaters, decorated for actions classified at levels above this observer's clearance. A very polite way of saying, we don't know everything they've done, and that's intentional. The first thing I noticed, when they let me into their forward operating base on a gray morning that smelled of copper rain and something burning that nobody explained, was that they were small. I know that's absurd. I've reviewed the xenobiology. I understand human physical parameters. But, you read a data file and you imagine something different than what walks into a room. Their commander, a woman named Senior Chief Vasquez, who I will refer to hereafter in logs as the Senior Chief because she told me her name once, in a tone that implied I would not be told again, stood at approximately 1.7 of their meters. She had gray threading through her dark hair. She had a scar on her left jaw that formed a perfect right angle, which I later learned was not from combat. I didn't ask how she got it. I logged the question and left it unanswered. She looked at me the way you look at furniture you didn't order but have to accommodate anyway. "You're the observer," she said. "Yes, Senior Chief." "You'll keep up, stay out of the way, and if I tell you to get on the ground, you're already on the ground before I finish the sentence." "Understood." "You log things." It wasn't a question. Someone had briefed her. "I do." She looked at the data tablet tucked under my secondary arm. Then, she looked at my face. Then, she walked away, and that was our introduction, and honestly it went better than I expected. Timestamp 3.07, the mission briefing happened in a room with 1 working light and a map that had been updated so many times the original surface was no longer visible beneath the layers. 6 human operators leaned over it. 3 stood against the wall with their arms crossed in postures that, on my species, would indicate boredom but, on humans I was already learning to read differently, they were listening hardest. The ones who looked bored were paying the most attention. The objective was a directorate matter I'm cleared to summarize only broadly, a supply cache held by a hostile faction in a tunnel network beneath what had been a manufacturing district. The tunnels were old. The factions were newer and angrier. There were approximately 40 armed hostiles confirmed inside and an unknown number of what the senior chief, consulting the map with one finger pressed directly on the most fortified position, called maybes. Maybes? I asked. I asked because I log everything, and I could not log a number I didn't have. One of the operators against the wall, a man called Drez, who was very tall and had the specific quality of stillness that I associated with things that could move explosively if required, looked at me. Combatants who might be civilians. Or civilians who might be combatants. Or combatants pretending to be civilians until they decide not to. He paused. Maybes. How do you account for them in planning? The senior chief answered without looking up from the map. You don't. You account for the certainties. The maybes account for themselves. She moved her finger. Entry here. Dress takes point. We fold the flanks in before they know we're inside. The cache is here, another tap, but I want eyes on this junction first because last satellite pass showed foot traffic that doesn't match faction patrol patterns. Operator named Hara, short, compact, the kind of quiet that isn't shy, said, patterns changed last week after their eastern unit got hit. I know. So they're adaptive. I know. So the whole map might be garbage. Yep. She stood up straight. That's why we're going in soft and we're thinking the whole way down. Questions? Silence. I had questions. I logged them instead of asking them. I was already learning. Timestamp 11.33 PRE insertion, staging area, it was cold. Not climatically interesting cold, just cold in the way that gets into your joints and makes everything marginally worse. I was standing beside a vehicle that smelled of machine oil and what I would later identify as a specific human ration bar they called the brick, which had the structural density of a building material and apparently tasted like sweetened cardboard. Operator Hara ate one every pre-mission. She said it was ritual. I logged it under behavioral anchoring, stress management. I was watching them check their equipment when I first saw it. The way they went into themselves. It wasn't visible, exactly. They were still moving, still speaking in the clipped, compressed shorthand they used with each other. Brevity is intimacy, I'd noted, the less they said the more they apparently understood each other. But something changed. An orientation. The way a door closes without being slammed. The senior chief was checking her weapon with her eyes down. Her hands did the work without her watching them. Her hands had done this so many times they didn't need her. She was somewhere else. Not afraid. Not excited. Preparing. I don't have a word for it in my language that isn't clinical. The human word I found later, reading through their cultural archives in the long nothing hours between operations, was zeroed in. Like an optical instrument adjusted until the image resolves. Like everything peripheral goes slightly out of focus so the center sharpens. I wrote in my log, they perform the ritual of preparation not to calm themselves but to invite the state. The state is not calm. The state is a particular quality of attention I have not previously observed. Then, I crossed it out. Then, I wrote it again. Timestamp 18.47 insertion -4 minutes, the rain came back. It came back in a serious way, which Drez, at the front of the column, checking a corner with the unhurried thoroughness of someone reading a menu they've read before, acknowledged with no reaction whatsoever. I found myself needing to record ambient conditions and discovered my secondary hand was shaking, which I noted clinically in my log as elevated sympathetic response, environmental stressors, and which was a lie I told my own document. I was afraid. I was afraid in the very specific way of someone who has studied violence academically and is now adjacent to it, and discovering the gap between those two things is enormous. The tunnel entrance was in the floor of a collapsed structure, a hatch half buried in debris, corrugated metal, nothing about it to indicate what was below. The senior chief crouched at the edge of it. She held up a fist. Everyone froze. Then, she held up 2 fingers. I didn't know what that meant. Hara, beside me, put her mouth close to my audio receptor and breathed rather than whispered, 2 heat signatures by the entrance. 30 meters down. From Hao Shu. I shushed. The senior chief made a different gesture. I didn't know that one either. Drez moved forward. He moved the way I'd seen deep-water predators move in documentary footage, not slowly, but with the specific patience of something that has decided it will close the distance but hasn't chosen the moment yet. He moved like time didn't apply to him in quite the same way it applied to other things. And then, there was a sound. Not loud. Not what I expected. Barely any sound at all. And the senior chief dropped into the hatch. And they all followed. And I followed them, because I had said I would, and because the alternative was standing in the rain alone above a hole with 2 heat signatures at the bottom, and my self-preservation instincts were better than my cowardice. Timestamp 19.03, inside, darkness and, then, light. Their lights, not mine, mounted, angled, calibrated to give them vision without announcing them at range. I was behind Hara. My data tablet was off. I was breathing through my mouth, which my species isn't supposed to do, which I was doing anyway. The tunnel smelled of long habitation. Cooked food and fierce sweat and old metal and something chemical I couldn't place and didn't want to. The 2 heat signatures were not in the positions they had been. The senior chief stopped. No gesture. Just stopped. And the whole unit stopped with her, not watching her, not waiting for her, they just stopped because she stopped, like they were the same organism distributed across several bodies. 10 seconds. 20. She turned her head 40 degrees. She moved left. Into a branch tunnel I hadn't even registered in the mapping. They followed. I followed. The heat signatures were in the branch tunnel. They'd moved there in the 4 minutes since the last read. Whether they'd heard something, whether it was routine, whether it was coincidence, I didn't know. The senior chief apparently didn't care about the reason. She had absorbed the new information and moved accordingly with the same emotional effect as updating a calendar. We passed within 3 meters of them in the dark. They didn't hear us. I have reviewed my log of that 22 seconds 17 times. I cannot fully account for it. 12 humans in a narrow stone tunnel, equipment, weapons, 1 alien observer with a clicking secondary claw stress habit I was violently suppressing, and nothing. Absence of sound as a skill. As a trained capacity. The ability to swallow the space you occupy. I wrote in my log, they do not merely move quietly. They remove themselves from the environment's awareness. This is different. I don't know how to quantify it yet. Timestamp 22.18, the junction the senior chief had flagged, the one with anomalous foot traffic, was a wider chamber. Crates. 3 tunnel mouths. 1 lamp. And 11 people where the satellite data had indicated a maximum of 4. We were 18 meters back, in darkness. I watched the senior chief. I watched her look at it. I watched her look for 11 seconds without moving. Then, she turned and the unit compressed toward her and she used her hands in the dark, and 3 of them, Drez, Hara, a third operator I catalogued as Brennan, dissolved into separate tunnel mouths, not the chamber. Going around. She was going around the junction. She hadn't been briefed on 11 people. The map said 4. She didn't reevaluate the mission, didn't signal abort, didn't stop to confer in a way that would take time she apparently didn't think she had. She looked at the problem for 11 seconds and found a different door. I watched this happen and wrote nothing. My log entry for those 11 seconds is a single line, she already knew. Timestamp 29.55, we reached the cache room without contact. 12 people. 3 kilometers of hostile tunnel. 40 confirmed combatants plus unknowns. 0 contact. I was expecting celebration. Some expression of the achievement. A breath out, at minimum. Drez crouched next to a crate and pried a corner open with something from his vest. He looked at the contents. He looked at the senior chief. He held up 4 fingers, then made a motion I didn't recognize. She shook her head. He made a different motion. She pointed up out, extraction. He made the same forefinger gesture again, more insistently. His eyebrows said something his face otherwise didn't. She looked at the crate. She looked at the tunnel behind us. She looked at the crate again. She held up 2 fingers. He closed the crate. He opened a different one. He removed 2 objects I wasn't close enough to identify, secured them to his vest, and stood up. No words. The entire negotiation, and it was a negotiation, there was disagreement in it, mild and professional and instantly resolved, happened in gestures in a darkroom in about 12 seconds. I wrote, they have compressed communication to the point where it is almost biological. Not code. Reflex. They are not transmitting meaning, they are sharing it. Then, I wrote, I think they have been through enough together that the words are unnecessary. The words were always just the surface of something else. I stopped logging for a moment. Which, for me, is equivalent to a normal person stopping breathing. Then, I wrote, I don't know what that something else is yet. But, it's the thing I came here to find. The senior chief touched my shoulder, just her hand, just briefly, the universal gesture across species that means move, and I moved, and we went back up through the dark. And, in the junction chamber, which we passed again, going out, the 11 people were still there and, still talking, and, they never looked up. We came back with 2 objects from the cache and, no casualties, and, the senior chief sat down on a crate, opened a container of something that smelled like engine runoff with aspirations, drank half of it, and, started writing. That was the debrief. For her. For me, the debrief was 40 minutes of a liaison officer I'll call Commander Tail. He was Karani, my species, and I resented him immediately for being comfortable asking me questions I couldn't fully answer. You made no contact? Correct. 40 hostiles, you said. 40 confirmed, unknown maybes. And, they navigated around all of them. Yes. Tail made a sound that in our language indicates polite skepticism, which is a sound I have made myself many times and, which now, from the receiving end, is insufferable. Observer Oren. Were there actually 40 hostiles, or did your count? My count was pulled from the same satellite data you have access to, Commander. I can timestamp the entry. I turned my tablet toward him. I can also timestamp every position we held, every route adjustment, and every time the senior chief modified the approach in real time based on conditions the briefing didn't account for, if that would help. He looked at the tablet. He looked at me. You seem defensive. I seem accurate. He left shortly after that. I finished the entry. I ate something from the unit's food stores that I will not describe because it was upsetting. Hara sat across from me, eating her second brick of the day, watching me the way you watch a small animal trying to navigate a space it didn't evolve for. You doing okay? She asked. I considered this. I'm not sure okay is the relevant metric. She almost smiled. Humans almost smile before they decide whether the situation has earned a full one. I'd started cataloging the almost smiles as a separate category. First tunnel op? First anything like this. Yeah. She bit the brick. Chewed. Gets into you. What gets into you? She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. The quiet, she said. Learning to move inside it. She went back to eating. The conversation was, apparently, complete. I logged, she said, learning to move inside it, not learning to be quiet, which would imply absence. Inside it. As if the quiet is a medium. As if they live in it the way fish live in water. Timestamp 34.19, there are 22 hours between the cache operation and timestamp 0041. I want to account for them, because they matter. Because what I saw at 0041 would look different, would look like something else entirely, without the context of the 22 hours before it. The unit rested. They rested the way people rest when sleep is a tool rather than a luxury, with immediacy and completeness. Brennan was asleep on a surface I would not have described as comfortable within 8 minutes of returning from the tunnel. Drez read something on a small device and was asleep with it on his chest within 20. The senior chief disappeared for 3 hours, emerged looking no different, and began reviewing satellite data for the next staging area. I didn't sleep. I logged. At approximately hour 6 of my non-sleep, I was sitting near the operations table watching the senior chief scroll through imagery when she said, without looking up, "What are you actually trying to figure out?" I stopped typing. "I'm observing. The Directorate, I know what the Directorate wants." She did look up then. "What do you want to understand?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked me since arrival. I found, unexpectedly, that I had a direct answer. "I want to understand what you are when it matters," I said. "Not what the files say. What you actually are, in the moment where the variables exceed the plan." She looked at me for a while. 3 seconds. For her, that's a long time. "You'll see," she said. Not a promise. Not a threat. Just a fact, stated with the same flat certainty she used for everything else. I logged it. Timestamp 39.44 forward staging, abandoned infrastructure. The second operation was supposed to be an extraction. A Directorate asset. I'm not cleared to specify the nature of the asset, only that losing it was not an acceptable outcome, had been compromised in a holding position 7 kilometers from the forward base. The hostile faction had shifted their patrol grid in the 14 hours since the cache operation. Whether because of what we'd taken or for unrelated reasons, the Directorate didn't know. The senior chief knew it didn't matter. She said this in the briefing. Doesn't matter why. Matters where. She pointed. They're here and here now. Asset is here. We need to be here before they are. The asset's communication went dark 40 minutes ago. The liaison tail again, making his second appearance in my log and, my irritation, said. Yeah. So we don't know the asset's status. Yep. Senior Chief, if the asset is already, then, we'll know when we get there. She closed the map. And, we'll make decisions with the information we have, not the information we wish we had. She looked at the room. We leave in 10. I had 6 questions. I logged all 6 and, followed at a distance that I calculated, correctly, I believe, was close enough to be professional and, far enough to not be in the way. Timestamp 40.11 route, open ground, 2 kilometers of what the humans called bad ground, exposed, partially lit by infrastructure that still had power and, shouldn't, with 2 confirmed patrol routes crossing it. Moving 12 people across it required something between choreography and improv, and the distinction between those two things, I was learning, was thinner for them than for most. Drez was at the front. He stopped twice. Both times for reasons I could not identify until after we'd moved around them, once a patrol that turned into our path without warning and, once a gap in a damaged structure that would have announced our passage to anyone within 200 meters. I did not see him see these things. I saw him stop. I saw him redirect. The seeing had already happened in some anterior place I couldn't access. I wrote, their threat perception operates ahead of their visible attention. This is learned, not innate. The body has been trained to process at a layer below conscious observation. They are reacting to things they have not yet consciously registered. Then, I wrote, this is why they go quiet. The conscious mind is in the way. They silence it. Timestamp 41.00, asset location, interior. The asset was in a room at the end of a corridor. The corridor had 4 hostiles in it who were not supposed to be there. This was the moment the senior chief had said I would see. She assessed it in 2 seconds. I know this because I was watching her and, I counted. 2 seconds of looking at 4 armed individuals who were between us and, the objective and, who were actively alert and, in communication with their patrol network. Then, she looked at Drez. Then, at Brennan. Then, at 2 others whose names I was still logging when things started happening. No words. No gestures I could parse. Something I can only describe as direction, a shift in where they were oriented that was also, somehow, a plan. They moved. I want to describe it accurately, because the Directorate's reports on human special forces operations have consistently failed to capture this specific quality, and I believe that failure is why 3 previous observers came back with incomplete data. They didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. They covered the corridor in a pattern that I would later learn is called sequenced clearing, but which, in the moment, looked like a single organism with 8 limbs deciding a problem. Each one was doing something different, and all of it was the same thing. The space collapsed. The distance collapsed. For armed people had been between us and the objective, and then, in a span of time I find difficult to timestamp because my logging hand had stopped, they weren't. The sounds were small. That's the part one keep coming back to. I have a brain that is wired to associate conflict with volume, with the large noise of force applied to force. What I witnessed produced almost none. It was efficient in a way that felt biological. Not mechanical. Not calculated. Biological, the way a system optimized by a very long time of very serious consequence moves when it finally moves. Timestamp 41.34, the asset was alive. Injured, but alive, which Hara determined in approximately 12 seconds of assessment and communicated to the senior chief with a gesture I had finally learned. 3 fingers, tapped the shoulder, meant mobile, reduced capacity, extract carefully. The senior chief nodded once. The asset was human. A man, older, with the look of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has gotten very tired of it. When he saw the unit come through that door, something in his face did a thing I don't have language for. A release of pressure that had been structural. Like watching a load-bearing thing finally be allowed to not bear the load. He said something in a language I didn't catch. Brennan, who was securing the corridor, responded without turning around. A few words. Quiet. The asset laughed. I wrote in my log, he laughed. And then, I stopped, because I didn't know what to do with that. This man had been in the dark, alone, with his communication down and hostile patrols outside, for at least 40 minutes. And the first thing he did when help arrived was laugh. I looked at Brennan. He was still facing the corridor. I asked Hara, very quietly, what did he say? She was checking the asset's injury. She didn't look up. He said he was starting to think nobody was coming. And Brennan said? Brennan said we were just being dramatic. The asset laughed again, softer, and let Hara help him to his feet. I did not log this for 3 minutes. I sat with it in a way I haven't sat with a moment since my first field assignment 12 years ago, when I saw something I wasn't prepared for and needed a moment to reassemble around it. Then, I wrote, the joke is not a deflection. The joke is the thing itself. It says, you matter enough to make light of this, which means you were never really in question. It collapses the distance between what was and what is. It is, I think, a form of care so compressed it looks like carelessness. Timestamp 44.08 Extraction route, the 4 hostiles in the corridor were going to be found. The senior chief knew this. She communicated it to the unit with 3 words, clocks running, and that was the only acknowledgement of the new pressure. No elaboration. The unit's pace changed in a way that felt like a gear shift rather than a scramble, same quality of attention, higher tempo. We were 2 kilometers from the base. The patrol grid realigned at timestamp 45.19. I know this because the Directorate's satellite uplink, which I was monitoring on my secondary screen, updated with new patrol positions and 2 of them were moving toward our route. I almost said something. I didn't say anything, because the senior chief had already changed our route, and I hadn't seen when she'd seen the update, and at this point I had stopped asking how she knew things before I'd registered the information that allowed for knowing them. We took a route through a structure I would have called unstable. Dres went first. The floor held. We came out on the far side of the patrol grid sweep and moved the last 800 meters without contact. At the base perimeter, the asset was handed off to medical. The senior chief watched him go. She watched him for 4 seconds, which is, again, a long time for her, and then she turned and went inside. Timestamp 47.52 Personal log addendum. I am adding this entry outside the official log format because I want to record something that is not, strictly speaking, mission relevant. After the handoff, I found a corner of the staging area with the specific quality of not being in the way of anything and I sat in it and I did not type for 11 minutes. This is the longest I have gone without logging since childhood. I was thinking about the laugh. I was thinking about Brennan saying we were just being dramatic into a dark corridor, to a man who had been genuinely afraid, and the man who had been genuinely afraid choosing to take the joke and not the fear. Choosing the joke is the thing that was true instead. There is something here that I am circling without being able to land on it. It's not bravery, exactly. Bravery is a category I understand, the choice to act despite fear. This was something different. This was the maintenance of a particular quality of themselves, even when the situation argued strongly against it. The joke was not despite the fear. It was instead of it. Not denial. Something more active. They had decided, these people, at some prior point, what they were going to be. And they were being it. Consistently. In the tunnels and, in the corridors and, in the dark, they were being the same thing. The situation changed. They didn't. I wrote, they are not defined by their circumstances. They define their circumstances. This is different from what it sounds like. It's not optimism and it's not stubbornness. It's a prior decision, made before the specific crisis, that holds. I closed my log. Drez walked past. He was eating another brick. He looked at me the way you look at something you're not sure about. You good, he said. I thought about what Hara had said. Gets into you. I think so, I said. He nodded, once, and kept walking. Week 3. I have stopped counting entries by number and started marking them by what I ate, which is a system I developed because it breaks the time into human-sized units. Today is a flat circular bread that tasted better than it looked and a protein substance nobody named for me. The directorate sent a formal query at timestamp 59.02, initial observations? Working hypothesis? I wrote back, insufficient data for hypothesis. Continue observation. This is a lie. I have hypotheses. I am not ready to submit them because I am not sure they are the kind of hypotheses the directorate is looking for, and because there's something I haven't seen yet. I can feel the edge of it the way you feel a word you know but can't place a pressure behind the knowing. The senior chief, for her part, has stopped pretending I am furniture and started occasionally leaving me in places where I will learn things. Not telling me what to watch. Just positioning me. I logged this shift at timestamp 56.19 and wrote, she is no longer neutral about my presence. She has decided I might be useful if I see certain things. I am, very carefully, not asking what things. Timestamp 63.11 Mission Briefing, 3rd OP. The third operation was different. The first two had been what I'd categorize as controlled, defined objectives, usable maps, tolerable unknowns. This one had all the structural features of a plan built on information that was 3 days old and, therefore, as the senior chief said with the tone of a person reading off a grocery list, largely decorative. Objective: reach a communications relay station in a contested zone, verify whether it had been compromised, and either secure it or deny it. Time sensitive because another directorate asset was using the relay. The relay station sat in an area where two factions had been actively contesting for 46 hours, which meant the tactical picture was, in the words of the operator Brennan, a snow globe someone sat on. Meaning? I asked. I was logging. Shaken up, he said. Nobody knows where anything is anymore. Including us. Then, how do you plan? He looked at me with the specific quality of patience someone uses when they've explained a thing before and are resigned to explaining it again. You plan for the first 5 minutes. After that you react. He paused. Good reaction is just planning that happens fast. I wrote this down. I have returned to it 11 times since. Timestamp 71.18 Approach, Contested Zone. The contested zone announced itself in sensory terms before any visual confirmation. Smoke, but layered, not one source, several, at different stages of burning, which meant the conflict had been episodic across the area over multiple hours. A specific quality of silence that wasn't peace. The kind of silence that fills in where noise has recently stopped and hasn't decided whether to return. Hara, 2 positions ahead of me, smells like a bad call. Dres, somebody's bad call. The senior chief said nothing. She was reading the ground with her eyes in a way I can only describe as fast and deep simultaneously, the visual equivalent of the scan you do when you walk into a room and something is wrong before you identify what. There was a body at the edge of the next structural collapse. Faction markings, but which faction was, apparently, not immediately determinable. The senior chief looked at it for 2 seconds. She pointed at Brennan, made a small circular gesture. Brennan peeled off. 2 other operators with him. They disappeared into what appeared to be impassable terrain and reappeared 90 seconds later from a completely different angle. I wrote, she knew there was a second body 30 meters further in before anyone could see it. She sent Brennan to check a sightline I couldn't identify the purpose of. When he came back, the gesture he gave her confirmed something, what, I didn't see. She changed our approach vector. I was watching closely enough to catch none of the actual decision. Timestamp 74.03, the relay station was occupied. Not by the faction we'd been briefed on. By both factions simultaneously, which was, as Hara said, with an admirable economy of expression, a new development. The intelligence picture had been accurate when written and was now historical. The 2 groups who had been shooting at each other for 46 hours had reached some interim accommodation, temporary, probably, functionally irrelevant to their ideological differences, based entirely on mutual recognition that holding the relay station mattered more, in this moment, than fighting each other. Approximately 20 individuals. 2 distinct groups in a state of armed mutual tolerance that had the structural stability of something held together by the shared understanding that if either side moved wrong, everything would collapse at once. The senior chief found a vantage point above and outside the station's sightlines. She watched for 4 minutes. Full minutes. I was watching her watch, which is how I spent a meaningful portion of my 3rd week and will probably spend the rest of my life, given the efficiency of the educational experience. Dres was beside her. He was very still. The specific very still of someone who was not waiting for permission but is waiting for a signal, because the signal is the same as permission, because they've agreed without speaking that this is how it works. She turned to him. She held up 3 fingers. Then, 2. Then, made a motion I didn't recognize, pulling toward herself. He almost did something with his face that wasn't quite a smile. Yeah, he said, very quietly. 1 word. She turned away. I wrote, she has a plan. And then, I cannot determine what it is from the gestures. And then, I'm not sure it matters whether I can determine it. Timestamp 76.44, what happened next took 11 minutes. I am going to attempt to log it accurately, which means accepting that my log will be incomplete, because some of what happened occurred faster than I could track and some of it occurred in a register I don't have instruments for. Brennan and 2 operators entered the station from the east, which required them to cross 14 meters of open ground between 2 active observation posts in the time that neither post was looking at the ground between them. This window was 6 seconds. They crossed it in 6 seconds. I watched this happen and wrote, I don't know how they knew when the window was. The senior chief, Dres, and Hara went in from the north at the same time. Not coordinated by signal. Coordinated by shared model. The same understanding of the same moment. Inside the station, there was a period I can't timestamp precisely because things moved in a way that overwhelmed sequential logging. I logged impressions, shouting. Not from our unit. Then, not shouting. Something breaking. Then, nothing. Movement in 2 directions. Then, stillness. I was outside on Hara's instruction. I had been told, firmly, to stay put, and I had stayed put, and I am recording this accurately, including the part where I was very glad to have stayed put. The 11 minutes ended with Brennan coming to the station's north access, holding up a closed fist, which I had learned means secure, and going back inside. I walked to the door. Timestamp 78.01, station interior, 20 people were sitting on the floor. Both factions. Together, which was, given that they had been actively trying to eliminate each other for 2 days, a remarkable configuration. They were not harmed. I want to be precise about this. Not harmed in any way I could observe. They were simply sitting on the floor, and several of them had the specific quality of not moving that means I have run the options and this is the best available. The senior chief was at the relay equipment, checking the technical status with the same focused attention she used for everything, not hurried, not slow. Present. Dres stood in a position that covered the room without appearing to cover the room. He was looking at nothing in particular, which, I had learned, meant he was looking at everything. I pulled up a position beside Hara and said, as quietly as I could, "How?" She looked at the room. She thought about my questions seriously, which I appreciated. "You learn the shape of a situation," she said. "After enough of them. You walk in and you know which pieces can't move, which ones can, where the energy is sitting." The two factions were holding a line. Barely. You find the stress point where both sides are already looking for a reason not to fight anymore. You give them the reason. What was the reason? She tilted her head slightly toward Dres, who was standing still in the middle of a room of 20 people who'd been armed 40 minutes ago and currently were not. "Us," she said simply. "I thought about this for a while. They surrendered to you. They got to stop." She looked at the room again. "There's a difference." Timestamp 83.27 extract, logging the walk back, 4 kilometers back to base. Assets secured. No casualties. The relay station verified clear and operational. The senior chief walked at the rear of the column on the way back. She usually walked near the front. I fell in beside her, carefully, at a distance that said I'm not interrupting, I'm just present, and she allowed it. We walked for 300 meters without speaking. Then, she said, "Write what you saw. Not what you think the directorate wants. Those might be different things." "Yeah," she said. "They usually are." Another 200 meters. "What made you want to be an observer?" she asked. I thought about the honest answer versus the official one. She had seen 20 years of people giving official answers and I don't think she had much patience left for them. "I thought I could understand things from outside them," I said. "If I watched carefully enough." She didn't respond immediately. A minute of walking. "Does that work?" The honest answer again. "Less than I expected." She didn't say anything after that. I wrote in my log, later, she was not being critical. She was asking because she already knew the answer and she wanted to know if I did. It was a test with no pass or fail, just a calibration. Timestamp 119.02 Final log entry, Week 4, departure, my transfer orders came through. "I've been assigned to a new post, the directorate needs my skills elsewhere," they said, which means they've gotten what they think they need from this observation and want to reallocate the resource. This is standard. This is how it works. I logged the orders at 119.02 and spent 40 minutes sitting with the particular feeling of something ending that you were not done with. I submitted my official report. 17 pages. Behavioral patterns, tactical methodology, communication frameworks, operational efficiency metrics. All accurate. All incomplete. The incomplete part is this, which I'm logging here and not submitting. I came here to understand what made them what they are. I collected 4 weeks of data. I have timestamped entries for every meal, every approach vector, every gearshift of pace. And the thing I came to find is the thing that doesn't appear in any of it directly, it's only visible in the space between entries. In the 6-second satellite gap I never explained. In the 11 minutes I couldn't timestamp. In the moment Brennan said we were just being dramatic and the man who'd been afraid in the dark chose to laugh. What they are is not a trait. It's not endurance or strategy or adaptability in isolation. It's something that happens when those things compound over time and people who have decided, not been ordered, decided to be accountable to each other at a level that costs something. The laugh in the dark costs something. The joke in a hostile corridor costs the emotional armor you'd need to not make it. They spend that armor freely. It should make them fragile. By every model I have, it should make them fragile. On my last morning, Dres was eating a brick by the vehicles. He looked at my bags. Long ride, he said. Probably. He handed me a brick without being asked. I took it. I bit it. It tasted exactly like I expected. It gets into you, he said. I looked at him. Hara said the same thing. Yeah, well. He picked up his gear. She's usually right. He walked toward the briefing room without looking back. I held the brick. I wrote in my log, final entry, at timestamp 119.58, I don't know if what gets into you ever comes out. I don't know if it should. I know that I will go to my next assignment and my next after that, and I will have better instruments and newer data, and I will still be measuring something I first saw in a tunnel on a rainy night where 12 humans and one alien observer walked past 40 armed people and weren't noticed. And I will keep trying to account for the 6-second gap. I don't think I'll close it. I put my tablet under my arm and went to find the vehicle. The base was already moving on to the next thing. That's what they do.